He was a Maori man, tan and large. His sun-baked hands flew down to his knees, a sign that the ritual was about to begin. New Zealand was his home. This stage, however, was his battleground. He stood at the microphone but didn't use it. He didn't need to. His booming voice silenced the whispers of coffee drinkers and beer guzzlers. Taking a step back, he began to stomp, stomp, and stomp. The haka had begun. For residents of Wellington, this isn't out of the ordinary. For a student studying abroad from Texas, however, it's quite terrifying. The haka is a native war cry and dance performance, a common cultural activity among the Maori tribes of New Zealand. Loud shouting and wild arm motions are almost always an expectation, but this often occurs as the performer, or the performers in some cases, speak in a native tongue at special events or ceremonies. His shouting was in English and took the form of a free verse poem. This was my first introduction into slam poetry. The performance was at a small bar on the other side of the world, but I found myself hooked. I wasn't the only one inspired. A classmate had the guts to get up and perform a piece before we returned to the United States, but I hadn't mustered up the courage to join her. I watched as a member of an audience at several slams during my time abroad, wondering how anyone could feel so comfortable enough to perform on stage in front of complete strangers. As the weeks went by, and upon my return to Houston, I found myself researching local venues to immerse myself in the art form. This piece and production is about spoken word poetry. Thank you for joining me, and enjoy. This story begins as any real adventure should. A young protagonist finds himself asking a question. In this case, I asked myself why people perform spoken word poetry. What's so special about it? How do people become so comfortable enough to perform it? With nothing better to do on a hot summer evening, I found myself sitting in the black armchair of a dimly lit patio bar, looking up at a microphone stand. This is where I found myself. Avant Garden, a location of beer and finger snaps nestled smack dab in the middle of Montrose and Midtown, right off of Westheimer Road in Houston. You'd pass right by it if you didn't know it was there. Green shrubs, trees, and vines of ivy adorn the metal fence surrounding the parking lot of a 3-story historical house, run by a woman named Marina Lemisoff. When you manage to find a parking space, you'll walk through a tiny little gate and find a pathway leading to a backyard, complete with its own little bar. Steel chairs and small tables surround the roof's support beams, and lights sway like leaves in the breeze as they trail along the tops of the porch to the yellow sidings of the house. It's a humble home for a growing art form, and the warmth of the lamps and smiles on faces make you feel as if you were among long-lost friends. But I suppose that was the missing piece. I was flying solo on this mission, a lone adventurer looking for inspiration and an outlet for expression. Expressing myself has always been difficult, especially as someone who has always been labeled as the quiet kid. When people call you something, you tend to reinforce your own stereotype by abiding by the expectations. Cracking my social shell is no easy task, but I thought spoken word could teach me a thing or two about speaking out, letting my feelings loose, not just keeping them on the inside. I sat down and took in the scenery, not sure what to expect. When a mother and her son found their place on stage, I realized I had stumbled across something special. They shared their joint struggle with suicide and commanded the audience's attention. As a mere viewer, the words struck at me like knives sticking straight into my heart. The two took turns performing separate verses. The piece was not well rehearsed, but no one in the audience seemed to care. A deafening applause filled my ears as the pair smiled and left the stage only a couple of minutes after the performance began. The mother and son duo were no sort of Greek warriors. They weren't Odysseus or Ajax. They didn't wield weapons or have any assistance from demigods. They didn't sing of glory. They sang of sadness and destruction and the near loss of a family. Rooted in human history is a desire to share emotions, but here was a clear example of the evolution of verbal expression. It wasn't self-gratification like the Odyssey, but rather an outlet for pain. It wasn't a story of overcoming odds, but rather a cry out against an unfair world that almost delivered a mother and her child to death immediately. I started a poetry blog shortly after this event. I was inspired to start creating something even if I didn't have the confidence to express myself out loud. I wanted to be like that mother and son on stage. I wanted to shout out my problems and defy my inner demons. Tumblr became my new source of friends as I started a 30-day long poetry challenge. I forced myself to write one poem per day, and I stuck to the schedule pretty well during my senior year of college. Was it amateurish? Of course. Cowardly? Perhaps. But it was also therapeutic. Class and work kept me distracted for a while, but I eventually felt a gnawing desire to seek out another slam. The blog wasn't going to satisfy my appetite. I found myself back at that same venue. Despite my terrible parking skills, I managed to fit my beat-up Ford Explorer into the small lot on the side of Avant Garden's dimly lit patio. After fumbling with my phone, paying the $5 cover charge, and getting a nifty little sticker for following their organization, Right About Now, on Instagram, my hand was stamped and I was motioned into that same backyard area filled with small little chairs, smaller little tables, and the smallest little crowd. I had arrived at 7:30 on the dot, but quickly remembered, in the midst of cigarette smoke, background chatter, and clinging bottles of alcohol, being on time meant you were early here. Nobody was in a rush, or so it seemed. I found a seat 2 rows from the patio stage. Towards the entrance, plopping down on the black chair in front of me, I pulled out my pink sticky pad and started to take it all in. "Welcome to Right About Now, where everyone is welcome unless you're racist and orange, but nobody wants to judge here," proclaimed the MC of the night, a poet named Amir. I made a mental note of how many Trump jokes the host made and noticed that each one left the crowd clapping and roaring with laughter. Right About Now isn't a partisan group, but it doesn't shy away from uncomfortable topics. On the contrary, it sets up poetry slams to send poets to national competitions where they perform pieces about controversial subject matter and win cash prizes. Some slams are reserved for specific performers, but this was an open mic event, which meant anyone could get up and share a new poem. "This is our new shit night, so if you have a new poem and you want to read, come up and sign the list and we'll get started shortly." The event was underway 30 minutes later, another indication that this slam was made up of people who honestly didn't want to be held down by the clock. Ironically, the chosen poets for the night were allotted a brief 2 minutes to speak, but this was the nature of a slam competition. There will be several rounds of poems, the MC explained, and winners would be chosen from each round to advance. It should be noted that Right About Now isn't the first slam organization that came into existence, despite it being a popular refuge for poetry in Houston. As early as the 7th century BC, poets were recounting episodes from the Iliad and Odyssey out loud and competing for prizes, including bulls, wine, and goats. African tribes have been sharing oral traditions from generation to generation for centuries, and influenced poets and members of the Harlem Renaissance, which still has influences on American art and culture to this day. While the prizes and settings have changed, the desire for verbal expression is still very much present. "Now, before Trump bans free speech, let's give it up for Jason." The crowd laughed and applauded, while the MC motioned to a 20-ish-year-old Asian guy with glasses in the front row. The man strolled onto the stage like he'd done this before. I was certain that he had, as his verses came out as smooth as silk and left the crowd in awe. He spoke about heartache and loss, telling the crowd that you can't nurse a burn if you hold onto the fire. His arm outstretched, a cell phone in the palm, Jason continued to pour out his heart amidst the snaps of thumbs against middle fingers. The scent of cigarette smoke lingered from earlier, dancing in my nose, but also giving weight to the words of this man's emotional struggles. I felt better about seeing him hold onto his phone. It broke down my previous assumption that all poems needed to be memorized for spoken word. Some performers came up without the aid of a piece of paper or touchscreen, but nobody seemed to mind this guy's lack of eye contact with the audience. They applauded as he finished, and I watched as his grinning face left the mic stand behind. When Jason left the stage, a girl appeared in his place. "New shit," she yelled, and the crowd yelled back, "New shit." It's a common practice here, a ritual for these people. When a poet is performing a new piece and says the magic words, it's the obligation of the audience to echo back. Her poem was clever and sarcastic. It was a list of rules for women on how to survive in a world dominated by presidents who want to grab females in the crotch. Race-based lyrics, fast-paced rhymes, and body-shaming poems followed, but one stood out among others. A large woman with a red cap came onto the stage, taking the microphone and beginning a heartbreaking piece about her struggle with weight. "I'm a weirdo," she sang. A Lady Gaga verse accompanied her own original lines, creating a pitiful bastardization of song and free verse poetry that was complemented by occasional screams. The judges gave her good scores, but the haunting feeling she left behind as she exited the stage was intriguing. It made me wonder why and how someone in such a vulnerable state would want to speak so openly and so beautifully to a crowd of strangers about her Achilles heel. I looked down at the stamp on my hand and rubbed away the ink in a nervous frenzy as I anxiously thought about my own problems. Several poets followed, but few matched her raw emotion. One poet's piece about not wanting to be gender binary stood out as one of the best of the night, but the screams and voice of this woman still flooded my ears and refused to leave. There was a desire to be heard and not be ignored, a deep wanting among the poets to be understood and to have a chance to speak on a stage before the world and explain imperfections that nobody else cared to examine in greater detail. I wanted to be here. I wanted her confidence in those imperfections that really weren't imperfections at all. I decided it wasn't enough just to attend an event as an audience member. I would need to speak with the poets themselves, peek into their brains, and pry into their consciousness to fully understand the meaning of the art form. I needed to understand the artists, and perhaps even work up the courage to become one. If one thing had become clear, it was how accepting most of these audiences were of people who weren't professional poets. I thought how easy it might have been to just pull up my own poem on my blog, sign up on the list, and perform it. But I thought against it. Plus, the slots for the night had been filled. I left at intermission so that I could get back to an essay for class, but I couldn't get that woman's voice out of my head. I definitely needed more exposure. While researching more poetry events and venues, I stumbled across a spoken word event being held on my campus, the University of Houston, that was being advertised in the residence halls. With an open evening and no plans, I walked my way over to the student center and sat in the auditorium among a crowd of roughly 20 other students. It was a Friday night, but campus was more dead than usual. To be honest, I felt bad for the performers. I wished more people had shown up. Despite my reservations, I stuck around and shifted my focus to the poems being displayed. 3 speakers took stage, but a young man named Jeremy ran the show. Along with hearing his Kendrick Lamar poem, a crowd favorite, I would later learn that Jeremy was the protege of a slam coach named Outspoken Bean. The Asia Project, a 2-man poetry machine, followed Jeremy's performance. I was baffled by how much the pair had overcome, as stories of abortion, death, and cancer filled my ears. It was shocking to me how the performers were about just openness about their deepest struggles, and I knew I needed to speak with them before they left. An audience member volunteered to share a poem before the event concluded, and as the girl got up to perform her piece, I realized Jeremy had taken a seat next to me. I took the chance to reach out and talk to him. "Hey, I'm writing a paper on poetry. Mind if I get a few quotes?" He looked at me a bit confused, but agreed to chat. We waited for the final poem to end, and he began talking about his involvement with the art form. "So, what got you involved with spoken word and writing poetry?" I asked. He took a moment to gather his thoughts and replied with a calm demeanor. "Watching other spoken word poets and being inspired," he said, chewing on his lip and wringing his hands in between sentences. When I first started, the subject matter that really spoke to me was the most about growing up and experiencing all these changes through puberty and stuff like that. It was like, what do I do about this? I ended up writing. That's the avenue that took. After jotting down some notes, I was fast walking to the exit. I thanked Jeremy and luckily found the 2 lead performers for the Asia Project as well, standing by a merchandise table. For a man who had witnessed so much tragedy and had gone through so much pain, from the loss of family members to battling cancer, one of the performers smiled like nothing fazed him. His poems were about chaos and misery, and yet the man in front of me showed total control and happiness. I reached out and shook his hand, and asked the poet what advice he had for people who wanted to learn more about the spoken word poetry spectrum. Well, my first thing is that I always tell people is write true to you, first and foremost. A lot of people get into slam poetry and they try to sound like another poet, or they think a certain subject will get them famous or popular. Just write true to you, and as long as it's coming from inside you, it's going to be amazing. He had echoed an idea present in poems that I had heard before, a genuine quality of transparency and realness that only an individual could develop and understand for oneself. DMX, a poet from an HBO poetry series called Def Poetry Jam, once performed a piece about something similar. "The industry," he had said, "is about playing the game. I'm not an industry artist. I'm an artist in the industry." He was a performer who knew what it took to get by, but also refused to sell himself out and become something fake in the process. I think that was my key takeaway from these artists. They weren't afraid to dive into uncomfortable topics, but they knew how to discuss those subjects in a way that was honest and beautiful. They were just as human as me. Jeremy used poetry at a young age to express himself during a time of uncertainty and growth, while Asia Project, the 2-man group, focused on keeping the art genuine. It made sense not to imitate others when the point of the art form is self-expression, not copying and pasting words. It isn't about popularity, but rather about sharing oneself with the world. I took their advice to heart and made my way back to my dormitory. However, I still felt like I needed more information. I found myself typing away at my blog when I came up with an idea that really set my investigation into motion. I decided to create a Facebook status about the project, asking for poets to provide me with personal interviews and opinions about spoken word poetry. I asked my friends and family members to share the status around, which ensured that people beyond my circle of friends would see it. I went to bed thinking that I would get a couple of likes, maybe a couple of leads, but was surprised to wake up and find myself staring at about 30 notifications and several messages from people who wanted to partake in the project. I was onto something. Within a week, I had several interviews and phone conversations lined up with Houston poets. Black Hole Coffee Shop is another hidden gem where art seems to coalesce. A maze of turns and a drive over a bridge led me to a poet named Tammy who discussed her love of poetry and performance over a vanilla latte. We took our seats on metal chairs on the concrete porch. "I wanted to say for a while that it was a lost art," she said, as she folded her hands under her chin. Her gaze scanned the parking lot and returned to the camera and laptop in front of her. "Not a lot of people in our generation were really appreciating it anymore that I feel used to. But when I took a class my senior year, I met so many people with different degrees, and they were all poets of their own regard." She went on to describe the mannerisms of the poets she met, and told me that she has been performing spoken word pieces since last year. She also made sure to point out the hidden nature of the artists who spoke their own poetry in live form. "I feel like poets are really inclusive, so they're not like, 'Hey, I'm a poet.'" She waved her hands a bit, raising her voice as if to imitate artists pursuing fame through their craft. "They do it for themselves." I asked her for any last bits of advice before leaving, and her reply rolled off her tongue as if it had been waiting to escape. "Write a lot of shitty work. It's a really good learning experience. We're supposed to hate our work. That's how we get better. I think more people should give it a chance. It's storytelling, just in a different form." One day later, I found myself sitting in the exact same spot at the exact same coffee shop. This wasn't just out of my desire to go there again for a latte, but rather the second poet's request to meet me there. This man was a local master of spoken word poetry and went by the name Outspoken Bean. I won't lie, he was a bit intimidating, and not just because of his reputation for being one of the best spoken word poets in town. He was serious about his work, and he made it known. "It's a muscle. That's what I wanted to say. You gotta be consistent and persistent. If you ain't got the grit for it, just do your day job and be a fan." He wiped his hands on his pants as he chewed rapidly on a cookie, readying the next sentence before his mouth was done chewing. "I've lived in my car for this. I've damn near been on the street with a homeless man giving him my last when I had no money for this. I created a job that didn't exist for this. You know what I'm saying? I've gone bankrupt for this." Outspoken Bean told me that he was a coach for young poets, and had worked specifically for events related to Houston VIP Poetry Slam and Metaphor Houston competitions. He told me he had even coached a Miami youth team and had been flown out for 2 months to coach the students. "It's a hard life," he said with a sarcastic grin. "I love it. I really do love coaching." I mentioned Jeremy, and his eyes lit up as he described their mentor-mentee relationship. "Jeremy? He's a phenomenal writer and becoming a better performer. Oh man, I see the things he's doing and I'm like, okay, change this up, and a lot of times it's trial and error. I believe in pushing limits. I believe in taking away comfort zones." Not only did Outspoken Bean take his own craft seriously, but he inspired other poets around him to do the same. "Life is a poem, man. Whatever you do is writing. Make your story, bro." This was something I found ironic. Poets like Outspoken Bean, who excel at verbal expression, rely heavily on writing too. Jeremy and Asia Project had mentioned this as well. I made several mental notes of this and left the coffee shop and prepared for class and the next wave of interviews. Several poets called me over the phone in the days that followed, and a couple had even submitted recordings of themselves answering questions about their work and how they got involved. The influx of information was overwhelming. I honestly hadn't planned for so many responses. I even had the chance to speak with the creator of Right About Now, the event I had attended at Avant Garden. He wanted to express a misconception about spoken word that many people don't realize. "I want to distinguish. Slam poetry to me refers to competition work," said Amir. "A lot of people say, 'I wrote this slam,' but they read it in a non-competition setting. That's not a slam, that's just spoken word. Not that it diminishes it or anything, but it's kind of miscategorized. That work could be slam, but in the moment it isn't." Over the course of the next 3 weeks, I found myself reaching out to other poets like Amir, venturing to venues to widen my perspective about spoken word poetry, and came across another astounding poet by a friend's recommendation. Rayla is a poet who works for a local educational nonprofit group and is well connected in the spoken word scene. She's a friend of Jeremy and Outspoken Bean and spends much of her time preparing what she hopes will become a full-time performance career. Between describing her involvement and explaining the essence of a poetry slam, she spoke about the injustices faced by the African American community and how that struggle is expressed in poetry. Slam has opened my mind to see that's okay to march to the left instead of the right. It's toughened my skin to let me know that there's people who don't agree. Like, F you if you don't think I have to write poems about as a black woman. F you if you're tired of black people dying. We're tired of being treated like that, regardless of whether you want to hear it or not. I'm going to say it. Rayla's advice spoke to the tenacity of people like Gil Scott-Heron and the Last Poets, people who spoke out against the establishment during the Civil Rights Movement and paved the way for the emergence of hip-hop and the revitalization of spoken word poetry. Gil Scott-Heron's song, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," speaks of a rebellious nature within human beings that cannot be captured in technology alone. It cannot be confined to a screen or a page. Much like poetry, the rebellion needed the right outlet. "You don't have to be a cog in the machine," Rayla stated. For whatever reason, this particular quote stuck with me. I thought about it and heard it repeated over and over as I came to the realization of why spoken word appealed to me so much. Anybody can perform it. There is no age restriction, no time limit on speech. There's no true barrier to what can be said and to whom it can be said. Spoken word is freedom and perhaps one of the freest form of art that exists. As I tip my metaphoric hat to the Greeks and civil rights heroes that came before me, I began to write my own poem and decided to perform it live. My friend Giovanni decided to fit his blue sedan into an empty lot at Avant Garden on a Wednesday evening. I'm his co-pilot, but I don't need GPS to help him navigate. I know the directions at this point like the back of my hand, and I tell him to expect a lot more people. We're just here early, even though we're on time. We wait a while and order some drinks to pass the time, but the ticking seconds that pass make me more nervous about performing. As a few people begin to congregate near the stage, I stand up and make my way over just to be sure that it isn't a line for the sign-up list. Sure enough, the list appears and I'm eagerly waiting to put my name down. My heart sinks a little bit. 14 poets are allowed to perform tonight, and alternates from previous weeks who weren't able to perform are given priority, meaning the list is already halfway full by the time the real line begins to sign in. By the time I get to the list, I'm the 6th performer on a new alternate list. "Please don't leave. If you're signed in as an alternate, you may still get a chance to perform," said one of the organizers. Giovanni asks me if I'm okay, and I shrug. I tell him that I wish I'd gotten here sooner. I take a sip of my vodka cranberry and wonder why, out of all weeks, the list had to be packed on the night I came to perform. I try my best to hide my disappointment and listen on as the performances begin. Next up, we have Kayla. I swear the MC is playing a sick joke on me at this point. Mispronouncing names, making me think that I'm next. I'm nervous as hell, and my stomach does flips as I realize the name she called is not mine. And another performer walks to the stage and performs. I'm too distracted at this point to pay much attention, and I try, but my focus is distracted. I shouldn't have come. This was a dumb idea. These ideas bounce around in my head and bounce around in my skull for what appears like hours, but ends up just being about 20 minutes until I hear some comforting words. Next up, we have Kyle Knight. I'm shocked and I panic, to be honest. Realizing some poets have gone missing or have been skipped, I walk up unprepared but ready to dive in. "Well, you wanted to express yourself, right, Kyle? You wanted to see how it feels? Well, here's your chance. Do your thing." "Can you hear me?" I ask nervously, as the crowd responds with head nods and a quiet chorus of yes. I grab the mic, tilt it to my mouth, and take out my phone. "This is my first time performing, so I'm a little bit nervous," I say openly to the crowd. They start clapping out of nowhere, and suddenly my shaking hands give way to calmness. A grin appears on my face, and I look out at the faces below. "New shit," I yell. "New shit," the crowd echoes back. And so I begin.
I always liked writing. I always liked poetry, and There wasn't like an avenue to write the way that I wanted to. Like sometimes I'd have thoughts and I'd be like, oh, well, I can't really like put this in an essay. And it's like if I make it into a structured poem that we're learning in school, it doesn't really reflect what I want to say. And then I got on YouTube and started looking up spoken word poets and fell in love, and that's how I got started.
Speaking for myself, I think that that desire to share a part of who you are through writing is something that I think I don't know that all writers feel it, because there are people who write and that never perform in front of anyone. They write prose, they publish novels, but I think that all poets feel it. I think that everybody who does perform poetry has that desire to share themselves, and I think that for me, it's just I love watching other people do it as much as I like doing it myself. And to answer your question, I think if there's that desire that drives a certain kind of person who has all these thoughts, who has all these words, I think really what we're doing up there is we're trying to find that we are not alone in whatever we're trying to express, whether it be something that's supposed to be funny, or whether it's something that's supposed to be very sensitive and very heartwarming, or brutal and gut-wrenching. I think the point of any poet is to get something out to the world, to know that we're not alone, or maybe to help somebody else feel that way too. I think anything that has to do with writing, performing, or I think arts in general is about finding a connection to another human being. And I think that for poets, and especially spoken word, it's just a much more literal way of doing it than painting on a canvas or even writing a song. I mean, explaining to someone what spoken word seems kind of seems kind of redundant. I mean, it's in the title, it's spoken word, but really to see the vibe of it and really get what it's about, you have to go see it for yourself. Like I said, that's what avant-garde did for me. The person that I went to start, I was like, oh, okay, there's people from all kinds of different backgrounds who are going to look all kinds of different ways from each other, who are doing all kinds of really neat things, and I think that's the best way to do it. It's find a local show. I'm sure every major city has at least one a month, and see if it's something for you. I mean, get involved, can mean different things. If you're a fan, you definitely want to go support as much as you can. If you want to start performing, then go and watch other people do it. And I think that'll help get you the courage to do it yourself.
Everyone, I think, has like a different motivation for doing so, but I think ultimately underneath all of it, right, there's some kind of human connection. And I don't know, there's some kind of feeling of reading something to like a room mostly full of strangers. There is a rush when you get on the mic to read, especially like the first time. At our venue, it's pretty supportive too. I don't really let people boo because I don't think it's conducive to basically providing a platform to bring in more writers.
Yeah.
I think people need space and support to grow, and like my old writing group, one of our writers is at LSU's MFA. The one in College Station, Mike Check. Another one went to Iowa Writers Workshop. So like some really good like academic writers come out of this, and then some of the writers are touring or they're working for publishing companies, and that's really what we want,
But there's just something about like reading other people's poetry, pulling out elements and making them into your own work. It's like having a cookbook almost, you know what I mean? You can cook the same 6 meals all day long and you're like, I'm the best cook.
Yeah.
Or you can like take risks, and that's what he got me and my classmates to do. So I still write. I started reading my work as of last year, and I'm still very much active with it. And I do it because I kind of have no other choice. It sits in here and it rots and it just drives me crazy. So once I get it out and onto paper, I just feel a lot better. and so it's very much an outlet.
What advice do you have for students like me or other people that are kind of like, are told by people in these other paths, like, your career ain't worth shit because it doesn't have money in it and stuff like that? What should our response be to people like that? You know what I mean?
You want my real answer?
I'm sorry?
You want my real answer?
Yeah, your real
Like
answer.
my honest answer?
Yeah.
They could be right. Could. It's contingent on you if they are. How bad do you want it?
Yeah. No, that makes
How bad
sense.
do you want it?
Oh, I mean, a lot. Yeah.
Then your actions have to show in that.
Yeah.
It's a lot of sacrifice.
No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
A lot. Straight up. Out the gate. A lot of sacrifice. And there's no path. Right? If you want to be a doctor, right? You don't want to be a doctor, but if you want to be a doctor, what do you need to do? I'm asking you, what do you need to do?
Go to med school.
Go to med school,
Take
right?
your
So
CAT,
go to
yeah.
college in like a field that you,
Yeah.
right? And then what? After you graduate, then what?
Just the MCAT, get accepted.
Boom. And then what? Get accepted, and then what?
There's like rotations and stuff.
Yep. After you're done with that, and then rotations, and then
Then you become a doctor, yeah.
You and I piece together that path. It's paved out for them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Law school. Paved out.
Yeah.
Dentistry, paved out. Everything is paved out because it's done so much in this industry behind it. Spoken word, even poetry, like that you can take the author route, right? Spoken word is so good. We're paving it.
Yeah.
I have some poet friends who are doing really well. Picked up some acting, do acting, still perform. Rudy, all he does is poetry. Travels the world. Ain't hurt at all.
That's really cool.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm doing all right. But again, I said earlier, I created a job that didn't exist
Yeah.
with writers in the schools. It didn't exist. It was a better poetry slam coach. It's not a job description you can check out.
Yeah.
I created, and then they have me as a coordinator for all the metaphor events, and then they have me as something else. They send me to travel. I created a job that did not exist, man. How bad do you want it? How much do you like ramen?
Yeah.
How much do you like relationships? How much, like, for real? Ask, like, you don't have to answer these. These are rhetorical
Yeah.
questions. Asia's doing well. Asia gets what? It's like 190 shows a year.
Oh, that's a lot.
190 shows. That's hard on your body. You're gonna pay. But it's nice when the Nokia calls you up saying, hey, that poem, I Want to Love You in the 90s, we want you to do one about Nokia, I Want to Love You like 2000s. It had to be a $20,000 check. Had to be. I didn't ask for it. Easy. And if it's not, more work is coming from that. Like, how bad do you want it, dog?
Yeah.
They could be right.
Could be. And I guess the final question that I like to just really leave off on is, do you just any last minute piece of advice you feel like that needs to be included in a project about poetry and spoken word? Anything that comes to mind that you'd like to be included?
Life is a poem, man. What you do is writing. Whatever you do is writing.
Like that's what
Write the story.